Our first speaker today is the Chief Policy Officer for HackerOne and the founder of the Microsoft Bug Bounty program. Katie, I'm gonna just pass the word to you and let you teach us all about bug bounty programs, I guess.
Right. You're not gonna try my last name?
No, oh, Katie, I will try. Moussoris.
That's it.
Oh,
That's
you
it.
see,
Thank
I
you.
trained so much and then I didn't use it.
Okay, so thank you very much. Definitely appreciate being here. So my name is Katie Moussoris, pronounced like a dinosaur, Katie Moussoris Rex. I am Chief Policy Officer for HackerOne. I actually see a lot of familiar faces in here from ghosts of jobs past and lives past here in the Bay Area, so it's really good to be here. We're actually going to go through a pretty brisk agenda, and I hope that we have time for questions at the end. But I'm going to talk about the inception and the process of creating Microsoft's first ever bounty programs. How many of you are familiar with Microsoft's bounty programs, my former employer's bounty programs? Okay, a few of you. Well, I'm just going to show you some of the data that went into the planning of these programs and some of the hypotheses that we had going into it, how well we did against those hypotheses, and then talk about ways to strategically structure bounty programs if you were thinking about it. How many of you are at organizations that have bounty programs like Facebook? Okay, how many of you are at organizations that are seriously considering a bounty program? Okay, how many of you have a bounty program but you're thinking about scaling it out some more? Expanding. No, nobody's expanding. All right, that was the one piece of feedback that the content organizers asked me to add to this presentation, so I guess we'll skip that part. So, who am I? I am currently Chief Policy Officer for HackerOne. That is a lovely title that we made up. But essentially, I'm looking for two other Ps so that for Halloween I can be C3PO. I am the mother of Microsoft's bounty programs. I was content chair for Blue Hat, which is a similar conference like At Scale, but run at Microsoft since 2005. I was content chair for a few years. I've been a Linux developer. I've been a penetration tester. I founded vulnerability research programs. And as an indication of my extended masochism, I am an ISO standard editor. We are not going to talk about those things first thing in the morning. I do not want to hurt you. So, yeah, once upon a time I was a molecular biologist, so I do love me some data. So one of the things, I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, and my grandmother is laid to rest in the same cemetery as Buckminster Fuller. And so going to visit my Greek grandmother, my yaya, I would see his tombstone saying, "Call me Trim Tab." And so I had to look it up. This is a very strange thing. But for me, this has always resonated with me in terms of being a single individual and being able to just kind of stick your foot out like the little end of a rudder and turn the course of an entire ship. In this case, it was the aircraft carrier that was Microsoft that had refused steadfastly in public to ever pay for vulnerability information, ever. So this was an impossible super task that I was tasked with. So in 2010, Google and some other mainstream companies, competitors of Microsoft, started offering their own first-party bug bounty programs. So I was asked the question, if Microsoft were to offer a bug bounty, what would it look like? So I started with that question, and in fact, I had to take about 2 to 3 strategic steps back to look at what are the real motivations, what will actually align the engineers with the hackers, with the customers, what is going to create this win-win-win across the board and not overwhelm what was already, pretty much the biggest security response team probably in the world. So Microsoft actually receives, to secure@microsoft.com, which is the reporting mechanism for Microsoft, receives over 200,000 non-spam email messages per year on average that need to be triaged in some manner or fashion. How many of you are working at that scale? Not yet. Anyway, Microsoft had that going on. So for them, the idea of creating an incentive program to potentially draw more vulnerabilities into that queue seemed crazy. And then there's me. So these were the things I was up against. Microsoft will never pay for bugs. You'll never be able to compete with or outbid the black market, which I'm going to rename in a couple of slides as the offense-oriented market. And we will talk about purchasing motivations for each of the types of market. And then also, of course, you'll never be able to buy the most serious bugs. So through the data, we actually disproved all of these things. So in 2010, when I was asked this question, over 90% of bulletin class vulnerabilities, so those that are ranked by Microsoft as being important or critical on the bug scale, over 90% of those across all product lines that were being reported were reported directly to Microsoft for free. So of course, when I was going to the heads of IE, for example, heads of dev, test, and PM, and saying, well, this is what it looks like now in terms of reporting trends, but I'm a security strategist and it's my job to predict things. And they're like, you are Cassandra, you are doomed to know the future and no one will believe you. And so I had this data and they said, yeah, we're not going to change anything that we're doing as long as this is happening. But what I got them to agree to, which was very important at that time, was that once this started changing, once the trends started changing such that we were no longer, as Microsoft, former we, getting those vulnerabilities reported directly to us for free, if they were coming in through even third-party brokers like ZDI. How many of you are familiar with ZDI, Zero Day Initiative, right? So they buy vulnerabilities in major products, they create an IDS IPS, and then they actually pass the vulnerabilities free of charge to the vendors to get them fixed. So we would call those white market brokers or defense-oriented brokers. But coming to us directly had a set of benefits that I had to prove internally to the company. Something very important here is that not all products were actually created equal. I'm saying 90% of bulletin class vulnerabilities across all products. Certain products were very, very different in terms of the reporting trends, and we're going to dig into the data in a couple of minutes, but the browser in particular was different. So the case was made. The baseline was made. I did get them to agree in 2010 that once these reporting trends started changing and trending away from direct reporting to Microsoft, that they would begin paying for vulnerabilities. So what do you need in terms of a trend? You need 2 points and a direction to establish a vector, right? So obviously, I needed 2 years' worth of data to show this. So we waited. So let's take a minute to look at different types of fulfillment of, hierarchy of needs, if you will, right? So hackers, just like everybody else, are motivated by a combination of things. It's not just about money. If we were all motivated just about money, I'm pretty sure there are people with skills in this room that could have, been the Dread Pirate Roberts and lived in the Turks and Caicos by now. So we're not all motivated purely by money. We have other things going on. Compensation is one factor, but recognition and what I call the pursuit of intellectual happiness is another. There's a lot of behavioral elements that go into people making choices as to which market they choose to sell in. Otherwise, why, especially up until 2010, would people even having the option of reporting to something like ZDI and getting paid and still getting the bug fixed, why were they still coming directly to the vendor for free, right? Some combination of this going on. Now, recognition before Microsoft started offering bug bounties was in the form of 10-point Arial font in a bulletin. That was once currency. That was once actual currency, but that currency became devalued as real cash started changing hands more and more frequently. So this was the kind of picture that I was trying to paint for, the heads of IE and Windows, et cetera, to help them understand the world that they knew and the world where they had sworn never to pay for vulnerability information was quickly eroding and changing as these markets were emerging. So let's talk about what I previously would have called, and I apologize for this says mixed use market right here. But what I was previously calling the white, gray, and black markets, that's not really accurate because black market assumes that something is illegal. None of the vulnerability and exploit trade is really illegal. There are some international, there's a Wassenaar arrangement that has been going through that's trying to start restricting the trade of exploits, especially exploits having to do with surveillance, but that's another topic entirely. Right now, this is pretty much legal. So I'm going to call it defense market, mixed use market, and offense market. And what I mean is the intent of the purchase. So examples of a defense market, so the bug bounties that are offered by the vendors themselves. Obviously, they're buying those bugs to get them fixed. iDefense is another example. They are a broker, however, they are buying the bugs and they are passing those bugs for free to the vendor. And the prices are the lowest in that market, in the range 500 to maybe 20,000 or so. Mixed use market, brokers who don't share vulnerabilities with vendors for free. So brokers who will buy vulnerabilities or do vulnerability research on their own, and then they'll offer a subscription to anyone for whatever. whatever use they want, and they will actually offer that subscription service to the vendor themselves as well. But they won't give them a head start, essentially. So the vendor would be notified at the same time as the rest of the customers of these great mixed-use market dealers. And then the prices are definitely greater than $20,000, per, but often they're coupled with essentially an annual subscription fee that's usually six figures, maybe $150,000 to $300,000 per year for a bag of vulnerabilities in several different products. How many of you have heard of these types of brokers? Okay, yeah. Anyone want to call out an example of one of them? Okay, we'll talk about it at the break. Anyway, and then finally there's the offense market. So these are the folks that are buying things that have a motivation to keep these vulnerabilities unfixed and undetectable by, common defensive tools that are available to enterprises and consumers like AV, IDS, IPS. These are the folks that are going to be paying very, very high prices. I have seen models in this market where they pay a huge sum up front, a lump sum up front for the vulnerability itself, and then they pay an ongoing monthly fee for as long as that vulnerability remains unfixed and undetected by common defense-oriented tools. So they are literally paying for silence so that they can use them in longer criminal or surveillance-y campaigns or nation states, attacking nation states, that kind of thing. That's the offense market. So important to note here is that the defense market usually does not compete directly with the other markets. Why? Well, there's a price thing, and essentially the defense market is for those hackers who already have that sort of established, matrix of motivations that is orienting them towards that defense market in the first place. So one of the key things about creating Microsoft's bounty programs was saying, we're not going to directly compete with those other markets, and we will not do so on price. That doesn't make any sense. That's an escalation war that is not strategic. So what else could we do? All right, so Impossible Super Task was accomplished on June 19th of 2013. I happened to be in Bangkok at the time at the first conference, which was a whole bunch of response teams and probably the most hostile place I could have possibly announced Microsoft's bounty programs. There were a number of old school companies that literally wanted to throw me in the Thai River at that point because I had broken ranks. I had taken one of the most conservative companies and decided that we were going to start paying for vulnerability information, and suddenly all of them were getting questions. Anyway, my response, of course, was that Microsoft had the right to acquire vulnerability and exploit information in whatever way we saw fit. So here were the goals. These were the things that went into the planning. We had security goals, obviously. Learn about vulnerabilities that remained even after the security development lifecycle tried to reduce and eliminate the number and severity of vulnerabilities. So learn about them as early as possible after release. And by release, we'll talk about the timing of that and specifically what release we were talking about. There were community goals. Engage with new researchers and harness their beautiful minds. The community itself, as I was saying, over 200,000 non-spam email messages a year to secure at Microsoft. The community wanted to help Microsoft and its customers, still does, but harnessing them and focusing them and directing them was part of the structure of these programs very intentionally. And I will tell you, we got some pretty amazing results as a result of doing this in a certain way. And then finally, there is a vulnerability market that I was outlining for you for these bugs. Intentional disruption of this market was part of the goals of these programs. And I will walk you through exactly the ways that we did it. So, as I was saying, researchers who generally already sell to the defense market, we're providing them with focused incentives for things that would be the most helpful, the most beneficial to Microsoft and its customers and partners. Also, not a lot of organizations offering direct cash compensation for pure defense research. So there's actually still an ongoing bounty for new mitigations on the Microsoft platform worth $50,000. Nobody has claimed that one yet. Why? Because defense is hard. And then finally, shorten the expected usefulness of these vulnerabilities that are purchased with the express purpose of exploiting others. Okay. So, oh, wow, that animated. I wasn't expecting that. So PowerPoint still surprises me. So the actual bounty programs to date have paid over $250,000. 200,000 of those dollars, $100,000 apiece, were actually paid at once to 2 individual researchers. Let's talk about this. Okay, so bounties themselves are not one size fits all. That was something that I had to educate the Microsoft folks about, and because they had basically seen the basic online service type bounties where bug of this type gets this amount of money. They really weren't prepared for trying to retrofit, I think, over 800 different supported products and services into a one-size-fits-all model. Okay, so these were the bounty programs that were announced, and then there was a new program that was announced just about a month ago in online services, starting with the O365 bounty at a $500 minimum, but I'll talk about that at the end. These were the original structured incentive programs that were announced last year at Microsoft. So mitigation bypass bounty, it is not a bug bounty. It's a technique bounty. This is something that would pretty much only be useful to 2 types of individuals or organizations. One, the vendor who's trying to build better protections across the entire platform, so build the next ASLR or DEP across the platform. The only other type of entity that this is useful for are people who are interested in doing highly sophisticated targeted attacks. You do not need a brand new exploitation technique to attack most targets. Don't need it. Can use, existing mitigation bypass techniques like ROP, right? Return-oriented programming, or something like that. This was looking for things in the latest version of the platform such that the next version, or maybe the next +1 version, depending on how many structural changes would have to be made to the architecture of the platform to do this, this is really to improve the future of the platform. It was also going to be used to detect brand new exploitation techniques taking place in targeted attacks. So the number of individual hackers who are capable of finding new exploitation techniques is probably less than 1,000 individuals worldwide. This number has been corroborated with some of the other exploit brokers and folks like that. There are very few people who are capable of finding and exploiting issues in the latest versions of all modern software, not just Microsoft software. Of those 1,000 individuals worldwide, probably about half of them are willing to work in a defense-oriented manner, maybe for cash, maybe not. So you're working with the thinnest market possible. I paid this bounty out twice. So, to 2 different individuals. Blue Hat bonus for defense. This was the this was the compensation that was defense-oriented, and nobody has claimed this one yet. It's the $50,000 for a defensive idea. Why is it less than the $100,000, even though it's really, really hard? Well, because this one didn't require a proof of concept, just a white paper. That one required a fully working exploit. And then finally, the IE11 preview bug bounty. So IE11 preview was what Microsoft decided to rename IE beta, or IE11 beta. So it was essentially up to $11,000 per critical vulnerabilities that affect the IE11 beta during the first 30 days of the beta period. The timing of this was essential in creating this. And finally, this one that was just launched, I had planned this before I left Microsoft, but this is a very tightly scoped to just O365. And in fact, the irony here is that Microsoft.com, that domain is not in scope for this online services bounty. Okay, so what was the data? This was the actual graph with the projections that was used to convince the Internet Explorer team to offer a bounty. So what you are looking at here is the blue line was real data. So these were the numbers of critical vulnerabilities that were being reported to Microsoft during the IE10 beta period. Very few. And then suddenly, what happens here? A giant spike. What do you think this was? This was launched. This was RTM. So why, even when at the time over 90% of hackers were reporting them to us for free, why were they holding it? What was their currency? 10-point Arial font in a bulletin. No bulletins in the beta. They were holding. So even our staunchest allies in the hacker community, we had trained them to hold their bugs until the worst possible time. So this this was terrible. The other bit was that the markets that I was talking about that traded vulnerabilities were also not buying during the beta period. This is not true of all products. There are other browsers that certainly those bugs are traded during the beta period. You do need to actually look at your own data and how the researchers are behaving in order to make a model like this for yourself. But this is what was happening for IE specifically. Why? Well, let's see. There are fruit-flavored devices all over the place that people line up for, and they have them on day one and they pre-order them. I don't see any lines out the door for people installing the next version of IE. So it's not a target-rich environment even right after RTM. So that's why all of the markets are holding. Nobody is buying. That is why we got away with, essentially, moving the spike. This was a traffic shaping exercise, creating that bounty program. So what we did, I projected that if we did a bounty at the first 30 days of the IE11 beta, that we would, in fact, fill a gap in the market. And we wouldn't have to offer 6 figures, which is what IE bugs were going for on the various markets. So what did we offer? We offered up to $11,000 per bug. How did we do? 23 submissions, 18 of them were bulletin class. 18 of them were potentially tradable on the other markets for 6 figures a pop. 4 sandbox escapes came in from the same guy. During the triage of this, we're all sitting around the bounty table and triage table, and they were like, how did we miss these? And how did this guy find them? And I just said, he sees the woman in the red dress. He's in the Matrix. They're like, oh, yeah, that's about right. Yeah. Okay. He was actually the first claimant of the $100,000 technique bounty as well. So how else did we do? Remember, we had community goals. We had new direct relationships with researchers who were perfectly happy to get the bug fixed but wanted to get paid and had only ever reported through a third-party defense-oriented broker before. Guy was super nice. In fact, one of his submissions, he refused to take the money for it. He donated it to charity because he wasn't sure if it was a collision with something he had reported in an earlier version in IE to ZDI. This is how nice this guy was. It was awesome. So we knew it wasn't a collision, but we're like, all right, fine. One of yours goes to charity then. Okay, what a nice guy. And then finally, what this actually did was, because it was at the very beginning of the beta period, what were the engineers doing at the time? They were trying to close as many bugs as possible. This ended up being this extended test team between these particular hackers who decided to take up the challenge during this gap in the marketplace and the internal hackers at Microsoft who were trying to close as many bugs as possible. This was kind of an amazing engineering feat of reorientation in that first 30 days that was super helpful. There was a paper that came out, I think from Bromium Labs, that was showing earlier patches available for IE11, like earlier after release. And I said, there is a direct correlation because we got these bugs earlier. We got them earlier, meaning some of them were actually fixed in the beta period. Some of them were fixed pretty early after release. But the point is, the customers won, the engineers won, and this was because we decided to look at the markets and do something smart as opposed to just try and outbid another market. Okay, I got to speed it up because we got 22 minutes and I want to leave 10 minutes for questions. Okay, so remember the reporting trends that I was talking about, and I needed to show the reporting trends reversing. So IE in particular, 2010, for IE in particular, was deviating from that 90% mark by quite a bit, right? So this is the percentage in green. It's the percentage of brokered vulnerabilities that were coming through, primarily ZDI, right, and a couple of other brokers, versus the ones that were coming to us directly, former us. It's a hard habit to shake after 7 years. 2011, the trend just started going and going. This was the first half of 2013 before the bounty programs were introduced. As you can see, pretty much they were never going to come straight to us again after that point. So as soon as we started offering the bounties, this is what started happening. If you look at it, so this is the entire year, right? So that's what the entire year averaged out as. So we definitely saw a reversal in the trend of direct reporting versus brokered. This is if you look at it just from the half of the year where bounties started. That was the number that we saw. So not only did we see a complete reversal of the trend, but by far, These researchers just wanted to do the right thing and get paid. It was very simple. Shouldn't have ever really been a choice. So we made it so that there wasn't really a choice that they had to make. Now, the other really interesting thing about this is that targeting that incentive. So what helps an engineering organization learn? Learning about bugs in older versions of the products? Not really, right? So all of the researchers during that month, there were 0 submissions for earlier versions of IE during that month. They were all concentrating on IE 11 beta. This was an amazing thing for a company that was receiving over 200,000 non-spam email messages a year. So I talked about the guy who got $100,000, the first $100,000 bounty. His name was James Forshaw. He works for Google now on Project Zero. But at the time, he was at a company called Context out of London. And I remember talking to him in London. You know, he already knew he was awarded the money. And any of you figure out what this says? Go ahead. But I'm not giving a prize for it, so don't work that hard. But essentially, you know, I was talking to him in London, and he was coming to Blue Hat, and he said, "Oh, I'm picturing you handing me a giant check with my name on it." And so I'm texting the marketing people going, "Print a giant check. He wants a giant check." I wasn't going to do this because it seemed cheesy, but he totally wanted a giant check. So this was in the green room of Blue Hat of me signing it with a giant Sharpie. I don't even know where they found that thing. But not my real signature. Anyway, so, but yes, and this also says, this is not a real check, right there. But you know, he was really pleased to find it, and actually, so he found something that, by the rules of the bounty program, it was supposed to be something that was truly novel, not known to Microsoft at all. Now, in fact, one of the variants of what he found, one of our internal engineers had found a couple months earlier. However, we decided that docking him, 10 grand would have been so weird that we just decided to pay him the whole $100,000. It was close enough, and it was great work, and it was very well documented, and he had a fully working exploit. Good enough for me. So this bounty program is running year-round at $100,000 per against the latest version of Microsoft's available operating system. So at the time, it was Windows 8.1 Preview that he did this against. Why was it going year-round? One of the things that the researchers would wait for is a contest called Pondone. You guys all familiar with Pondone? Okay. So that price was set based on the top price at Pondone that year. So it was set at sort of the white market going rate. But as opposed to waiting all the way for a contest to maybe get lucky and maybe you'll get a new technique, but probably not, this was how I got Microsoft to agree to doing it year-round and offering it over and over again. The example I gave was LDR hot patch routine from let's see, it was Tombkeeper a year before. He had spoken about it at CanSec. It was used in one of Vupen's exploits at Pondone. Vupen decided to burn it because they knew that Tombkeeper was going to be talking about it, so it was already burned. If we had had the bounty programs at the time, the example that I used was we saw a tweet come out from a Chinese researcher, not Tombkeeper, saying, "I've got a way to bypass ASLR and DEP." Then we see a tweet from Aaron Portnoy from Exodus Intel, saying, "We think we have it," or "We think one of our guys has it." Then we see a blip on a little reverse engineering and exploitation forum that is, "Hey, I think there's something, LDR hot patch routine, I think there might be some way to bypass ASLR and DEP." We see this blip go up and then get taken down 5 days later in December of that year. We did not get this technique until March. So this thing was live and going, known by all of these like gray hat, black hat, whatever, green hat hackers out there for about 10 months before Microsoft got their hands on it. So that was the example. That was why this went on for a very long time. So remember I talked about the super thin market, 500 individuals worldwide willing to work on the defensive end, willing to work at those prices when they could command higher prices in other markets, et cetera. That thin market needed to be turned into a thick market. And one thing that I did in 2013, so a few months after, basically right after awarding James Forshaw that first $100,000 bounty to prove the concept that researchers would turn in brand new techniques, that this would actually work, then we opened it up to defenders worldwide. So essentially, even now, if somebody finds a brand new mitigation bypass technique that works on the latest version of Windows that is available, they can turn it in for $100,000. That essentially turned a thin market into a thick market. Everybody is a mongoose hunting cobras now, right? Nobody has come in with one yet. Why? Probably because you don't really need them to target even the most targeted attacks. You don't usually need them. But the idea is sound. Okay, so these were the three things that Microsoft's bounty programs did to strategically affect the vulnerability economy and exploit market. Market gap advantage, doing that time shift of understanding when the vulnerabilities were coming in, worst time ever after RTM, and doing some traffic shaping of offering the incentive at the beginning of the beta period. Ongoing $100,000 bounty, offering bounties year-round so that hackers don't have to wait until a one-time-a-year contest. And then maybe Microsoft would get a new technique, probably not. And then finally, decreasing the time that an attack goes undetected. That was the purpose of letting the rest of the defenders in the world who may find something in the wild submit for $100,000. So this was essentially the lessons learned from all of this, right? So obviously, you're never going to bounty your way to secure. You are never going to be, just like you can't pen test your way to secure, you need to invest in your SDL first and foremost. Focus on catching the bugs a lot earlier when they could be most easily addressed, and you can use structured incentive programs that take advantage of market gaps, that take advantage of timing. Understand what your finders, what your hackers who are looking at your stuff are doing with their research. Are they coming directly to you? If you don't have that data, start getting it. Do they report via brokers? Okay, so setting goals, measuring trends, studying the markets, and then the operational capabilities. So obviously, Microsoft had these clear goals: security goals, community goals, and market disruption goals. Not all of you are going to be in the space where you are actually trying to disrupt markets. Microsoft, obviously, being as ubiquitous as it was and being used in many, many targeted attacks that have hit the headlines over the past 10 years and not hit the headlines in the 20 years before that, they had a desire and a goal to disrupt those markets. But certain things that were discussed, that were passed over. Protecting the largest group of the existing customer base. So what do you think the largest existing customer base for IE, the install base, is? IE 8 is the version. Can you imagine Microsoft bountying IE 8? It was discussed. Anyway, but that's something that, if you don't have such an ancient code base and you are looking at it in terms of what's your largest install base, this is a valid consideration. Maybe you bounty to protect the largest group of customers. Microsoft ended up going with the newest products, and very specifically going with the beta period, and there were obvious engineering, alignment reasons to do so. And then finally, the goal of disrupting the adversaries. If you don't know who your adversaries are, it's probably time to start looking at that. So measuring the reporting trends, what are the trends overall? So I said, we had over 90% reported directly, but specific products were different. Browser was different. Windows is different. Office was different. And different sub-products inside of Office were different. So if you know about how your products are traded on the market, are prices going up or down? There are things that will tell you. So when I mentioned different sub-products within Office, what do you think the most expensive bugs for a sub-product in Office are? Word? Okay, that's a good guess. Keep going. Outlook? Okay. Anybody guess PowerPoint? PowerPoint. Why? It's actually much more difficult to hire an in-house hacker to find PowerPoint vulnerabilities because PowerPoint had a bunch of hardening stuff done to it recently. And that'll change, it's whichever product got hardened the most may end up, that is still attractive for especially for targeted attacks, will end up trending up in the price wars in various markets. So you need to understand your code base, you need to understand what the markets are doing with your code, and you need to understand what that may be telling you. There are other products, I'm not going to name names because they're my friends, but they don't trade in the markets because it's really easy and cheap to hire people to find those bugs in-house. You don't have to buy them. Ouch, right? So if you know about the market prices and what's happening there, you can actually extrapolate a whole bunch about your products and then where you need to focus and invest in your own STL. In general, if your bug count and type are going up in number and severity, you don't need a bounty. You need a better STL. You need a better way for your developers to not make the same mistakes over and over again. If they are going down in number but up in complexity, congratulations, your STL is actually doing its job. You will never be bug-free. But that is the goal. That is the trend you should be looking for. And ideally, your bugs being traded heavily on the markets is not necessarily a bad thing. And the higher the price in some of those darker markets is not necessarily a bad thing. It may indicate that you're going here. Okay. So, as I said, watch the markets, identify the gaps in the market. If you can fill a gap, if there is only an offense market for your stuff, it's probably time for you to bounty that particular thing and provide a defense-oriented market for that. There are ways to work with third-party defense-oriented brokers. Certainly, the ones who offer the bugs for free, that's great. If you have, if you have a decent relationship with some of those more gray, mixed-use brokers, which we can talk about in the hallway, you might be able to negotiate some deals with them. And then watch how the markets react. What are the pricing trends, etc. So, operationally, you're ready to do a bounty program. Many of you are already doing a bounty program. How many of you, I promised we wouldn't talk about ISO standards, but I'm totally going to talk about ISO standards right now. How many of you are familiar that there is actually a vulnerability disclosure ISO standard? Okay, one. All right, 29147 is the, you're just lying. You just wanted to, all right, great. So he knows about it. This is cool. So this 29147 was an ISO standard that I started working on at Microsoft because they basically said, Katie, you wrote Symantec's full disclosure policy, you wrote Microsoft's full disclosure policy, go find out what the Canadians are doing. And I did, and it wasn't good. So it took about 8 years for that standard to get published. It got published earlier this year. And spoiler, it's going to get revised, but the core elements are there, and it's essentially have a way for hackers or partners or customers or anybody outside your organization to find a way to report vulnerabilities to you. Have a front door that's easy to find. And then have a decent way to disseminate advisory information, so disseminate, whether or not the vulnerability affects certain products, certain versions, etc. And then there's this one, 30111. Do you know about that one too? Yeah. All right. Well, I was the editor of that one, and that is vulnerability handling processes. That's all of the internal capabilities that you need to do in terms of root cause investigation, et cetera, and trying to balance that need of speed versus thoroughness and completeness for creating the patch and making a remediation decision. So you need to be thinking about these standards. They're there for a reason. They're new. They just were published earlier this year. But go ahead and look them up, and then determine your bug servicing capabilities. Augment resources accordingly. So there are a lot of things that go into a vulnerability response program, and there are a lot of steps that you can take in-house. You can hire staff augmentation to do. You can figure that there's going to be a temporary spike when you first offer a bounty for anything. And in the case of IE, that was a deliberate spike that we engineered. But be prepared for that and either shore up your internal resources or staff augment as necessary. And then no bounty program is doing you any good unless you're feeding it back into your SDL, ideally in real time, exactly like Microsoft did for the IE bounty program and for the $100,000 mitigation bypass bounty. Okay. So in the end, there are many ways to structure a bounty program. You do not need to make your grandpa's bounty program. You can look at the trends for your own data and make your own models. And with that, I have about 5 minutes and 51 seconds left for questions. Yes.
And I just want to remind everyone who is asking questions that this is actually being recorded and is going to be put online. So if you have concerns about the question you are going to ask, maybe you want to save it for coffee break. But otherwise,
I do what you could call volunteer security work for a lot of small companies. How do I show or easily convince a small company what the market for their vulnerability looks like, even if it's looking at a broader segment? So there's no easy way for them to figure out how much money they need to invest, but they know they want to invest something.
Okay. So as in setting prices for bugs. So what kind of company is it? Online services or?
B2B online services.
Online services. So I would actually just look at what other vendors are offering for their online service bug bounty programs and price it around there. But the bigger thing that you should be talking to them about is their SDL, because if they're trying to just push out code without going through a security development lifecycle process and then use a bounty to try and clean it up, they're not going to be happy with that. So and they do have to have a pretty decent response program, because they could bounty the bugs and then have a really big backlog. So if you're talking to a small company, best thing to do is start them off with a quality vuln response program. See what the bugs end up coming in as, and then deciding how you want to structure the bounty programs from there. But yeah, in terms of pricing, if it's online services, there are a number of examples, and minimum tends to be around $500. Okay, next question.
anyone?
Oh, you're all saving it for the hallway. Oh no, except that guy.
1 second.
What?
Are there any other markets you've seen this not work for?
What do you mean?
Like enterprise software. Say niche market
IE?
enterprise.
What other kind of enterprise software? No, tell me. Yeah.
I don't know. That's hard to articulate.
Okay, so I mean, I think, all right, maybe a different question is, this was very obviously, except for the O365 bounty that just started, this was very obviously for what I would call box product software, right? So I think there are a number of industries like, critical infrastructure, that kind of thing, where, or like industrial control systems and everything, where people in those industries have asked me about possibly doing a bounty program, but they're afraid because even if they fix it, pushing out the fix to the already deployed and in service units is going to be actually very difficult, especially testing for app compat or regressions in various environments. So a bounty is kind of the front end of being able to get that information, but there's a whole other life cycle of creating the fix, testing the fix, and then actually deploying the fix that gets complicated with other industries. So maybe that was kind of the vein of your question, maybe it wasn't, but essentially, not all software is going to be as easy to push out a fix as sort of the well-established software from a major corporation that already has an established update channel, etc. One more question.
Anyone? I have one.
Okay.
So, and how does it, I always worked at, in companies that do, online services, like Facebook. I was at Google previously. Well, I was at IBM, but I don't know what they do there.
They wanted to kill me, by the way, when I announced that particular.
What is the difference? We have our bug bounty program here, and but it's very different than, boxed software that you just, hey, this is the release date, and because we are continuously releasing that, does that affect how the programs are run, in your experience with also the Office 365 is actually online service, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, because with box products, you've got numbers of different versions out there in the world and deployed. So that absolutely affected some of the strategy that we put into thinking about it. As I said, do we bounty the most widely deployed version and protect the most customers? And actually, one detail I left out of this was that any vulnerability that affected IE11 preview that also affected down-level supported versions, all of those were backported. All of those fixes were backported, so that even though we were only bountying the latest, we still were actually passing that on to every supported customer of the product. But when you're working with online services, you control the deployment, you control the timing, you control, you can roll it out to a subset of your users, in terms of a fix. You could roll out a temporary fix, roll it back. You have a lot more granular control, and you tend to be able to operate with a lot more speed. Luckily, the finders who were working with us through the Microsoft programs were already used to Microsoft speeds, so they were gentle even with a bug bounty program in place. And I think we don't have any more time for questions, but I definitely am. I'll be here all day, and happy to take any of your questions. And other than that, thank you, Facebook, and thank you very much.
Thank you.